Hey guys, in this video we're going to talk about the French 1935A and 1935S pistols and why exactly France has two 1935 pistols. Now before we talk about the 1935 pistols, we need to go back in time a little bit into France's military history. One of the more modern revolvers that the French had was the MLE 1892 here, which is a pretty decent revolver. It's kind of unique, some unique features on it. If you wanna see a shooting video of this, I'll put a link up there. Now, of course, with the 1892 and with World War I happening, they actually stopped making the 1892 revolvers during World War I because they needed to focus on rifles and machine guns, more important things than a handgun. And so that's when a lot of other like Spanish pistols popped up, like the Ruby here. This is an actual French-used World War I Ruby, but again, if you want to know more about the Rubies, I'll put a link to a video up here. They also bought Spanish-made like Smith & Wesson copies for World War I. So the French had kind of this hodgepodge of all these kind of different guns and different calibers that they had after World War I. So in 1922 is when the French program officially started to replacing these obsolete arms. Inside of this program is the program for selecting handguns. And pretty much they looked at handguns from just about everyone you could think of, like Mauser and Astra, their own internal, domestic guns. They looked at handguns from all around the world, American designs. And they were having these little like sort of mini trials throughout the whole 1920s. It's kind of like every other year they were looking at handguns. And this stretched on like quite a while. Now in the late 1920s is kind of when they were formulating the exact requirements that they wanted for their new handgun. So that's when they kind of came up with the specifications for their kind of major trial in like 1930 and 1935. Was when they kind of really, whittled down the contestants. So the specifications, kind of interestingly, a specification was dropped, or a requirement earlier for high capacity was dropped, and these new requirements, they didn't require high capacity, but they wanted the same general system as the Colt 1911. So I guess the French really liked, the M1911 pistol. They wanted to have a magazine safety. That's kind of the value of a magazine safety is kind of dubious. But they wanted it. It's not like uncommon with military handguns at the time. They wanted a manual safety. This is kind of the most unique part. They wanted a manual safety on the slide that did not stop the hammer from falling. Didn't prevent you from pulling the trigger. Instead, their safety that they wanted would block the firing pin. So you could, flick the safety on, pull the trigger, and know that when you pulled the trigger and the hammer fell, that the gun, wouldn't fire. It's kind of a weird thing. I have a feeling this was used mainly as sort of like a decocker, which if you're getting your guys in the habit of pulling the trigger to decock their guns, I could see kind of safety issues coming about because of the safety. But that's kind of one of the more interesting features of these guns. Also, they wanted it to be, no tool disassembly, and they wanted this pistol to be in 7.65 by 20 millimeter, aka 32 French long. So that's the requirements that they had. Now the new trials, the most recent trials, or maybe the last one that they had before selecting these handguns was in 1935. There were 8 pistols that were submitted to this test, including like a proto high power. So a proto Browning high power was submitted to that test. Interestingly enough, the high power with its high capacity and everything was not selected. A lot of people kind of talk about this as being sort of a huge mistake that the French made. But they made the decision that they did, and actually the pistol that won was what became the 1935A pistol with its Swiss-French designer. So 7.65 long, or it's called like 32 French long, or French 7.65 long. There's a lot of names for this round. Pretty much it comes from the Pedersen device, the cartridge that was meant to be used in the Pedersen device in the 1903 rifle. Some specs about the 32 long is that it was about 77 grain It was a 7.7 grain bullet, about 1,100 feet per second, which delivered 210 foot-pounds of energy. It's no slouch. I think the best direct comparison is maybe with 380. 380s, a lot of military loadings tend to be about 90 to 95 grams, 1,000 to 1,200 feet per second at 200 to 300 foot-pounds. So 32 French long, it seems to be a little bit less powerful than 380, and it's longer too. It's a pretty long cartridge. It's 7.65 by 20 millimeters. So it's kind of an interestingly long cartridge. Now the 1935A was designed by a guy named Charles Gabriel. Looks like Peter, but it's probably Peter or something French like that. He was a Swiss gun designer, but I think this was one of his first gun designs actually. Very good for for your first gun design if this is what it is. Now he worked for a company that was Alsatian. I'm not even going to try to pronounce the company's name. I'll put it on the screen here. But it's an Alsatian design, so therefore that's where the A comes from in 1935A. Feels good in hand. It points well. I think I see why this pistol won. It seems like a really good design. So the 1935A was adopted in 1937. It's one of those things where the date doesn't necessarily correlate of the gun and when it was adopted. And it seemed like pretty early on the French were already questioning whether or not this one company had the capacity to make enough handguns to arm the French in time. I think by 1937 they probably see the writing on the wall with the Nazi Party in Germany and everything. So interestingly enough, maybe you would think like more companies. They'd maybe license this out to other companies and kind of start making them, a bunch of different companies making them. That's kind of the way a lot of companies, or a lot of countries do their handgun design and development. But not the French. The French decided to go with a runner-up pistol, and that is the 1935S here. In this case, the S stands for Sonantien. Probably mispronounced that, but this is an actual like French Arsenal designed pistol, and again, holding this, playing with it and everything, I see why this pistol was a close runner-up. Overall, a good feeling handgun. In fact, the 1935S reminds me quite a bit of the high power overall ergonomics and handling. It's a pretty good feeling handgun. So it's not a bad choice for a runner-up. Now, because this is a French Arsenal design, it's not hampered with the same kind of intellectual property rights bottleneck as the 1935A. This pistol was eventually made at 4 different plants. Pre-World War II, just 2 different plants were making this pistol. And, you'd think these are called, 1935. Yeah, they were adopted in 1937. You'd think that they could get these things, cranked up and pumping out by the time World War II, officially happened in 1939, and then the German invasion of France in 1940. You would think that would happen, but it really didn't. Handgun production for the French were really sluggish. Now, about 10,700 of these 1935As were made prior to the German invasion, and quite a bit less than that were made of these 1935Ss. So not a lot were made before the war. It's the least common type of these pistols that you'll find is these really early ones before the German invasion. Now, a couple misconceptions about these pistols is that some people think that like one design copied another design. That's not really true. These pistols didn't copy each other at all. If you take them apart and you look at like the operating mechanisms in both, you could tell they don't really copy each other. But they do share a common heritage from the 1911. So it's kind of interesting. It's just kind of like 2 different versions or 2 different thoughts on a simplified 1911 design. Now, after the French defeat, the Germans in October of 1940, they restarted production of the 1935A. They called it the Pistol 625F, F for Frankreich or France. They made about 23,000, little over 23,000 of these, 1935As. So you will find them with a Waffenamt, that was accepted into German military service. Those are also pretty highly faked. A lot of times people will just get those, stamps, and they'll stamp a later made, like a post-war made pistol like this with it. The main way you can really tell is by, looking up your serial number and kind of seeing if it's a wartime or pre-war, post-war serial. That's the main way of doing it. So see you wafting up on a gun, just depending on what it is, don't take that as proof that it is a German pistol. But the Germans did make, quite a few of these, 23,000. Now, the 1935S production is kind of different. For whatever reason, the Germans really never did make these 1935Ss. Not sure. It's just kind of one of those interesting things. Like, why did the Germans never, make like the Moss 1944 semi-automatic rifles and stuff like that? Maybe the French did a good job at, keeping a lot of their arms secret, or hiding their stuff, or had some sort of deal, or the Germans looked down on it. Not sure, but they didn't actually make any of these 1935 S's. Now, as soon as these factories were liberated from the Germans, the French resumed production pretty much immediately. In 1944, they resumed production of these pistols, and really a lot of their arms they picked up making as soon as possible to try to arm, the Free French. Can't blame them for starting up production right away. I wonder if those, production workers kind of got whiplash from changing hands, so many times and everything in the war. But these were made after the war as well. These were made well up until 1950. In fact, the 1935A pistols, majority of them were made after the war. I'll put some totals up on the screen right here so that you can see the 1935A production numbers and the 1935S production numbers. Fairly similar amount of both pistols were made. Now let's get in and do some close-ups of these pistols, and I'll show you some of the differences between them. So here's the 1935A and the 1935S. You could tell just by here that the A is quite a bit larger than the S. Now most of that is just in the slide and barrel length. Otherwise, these are pretty similar size. They both have an 8-round capacity. Now you can kind of tell that the grip sort of contour on the A is it's a really good feeling design. It's not like the A feels like a whole world better than the S, but this is just a bit more plain feeling. The A definitely feels and aims a little bit more like a target pistol. It's really quite nice. Now again, if we wanted to compare the 1935A to what it's based on, here's an M1911A1. And this gun, you don't really think of a 1911 as being huge, but it does kind of dwarf this 1935A here. But we'll use this 1911 just to sort of compare some of the differences between the two pistols. First off, the 1935A, it has a loaded chamber indicator right on top of here. With the paint, you might not be able to notice super well, but it has a loaded chamber indicator that the 1911 does not have. Of course, the manual safeties are different. They're both hammer-fired guns, but the 1911, the safety does actually prevent the hammer from falling, and it's the safety is mounted on the frame instead of the slide. Obviously, I think this is much more preferred to this French style. So right now with the safety off, you can kind of see above the firing pin there's this sort of block. Now it's flat right now, meaning that the hammer can reach the firing pin, but when you rotate this upwards, the curved side of that now extends out and will block the hammer from hitting the firing pin. On the 1935A, when the safe is on, it's going to be up like this, which is pretty nice. If you're going to be shooting, this is a pretty good indicator that your safety is on. Now the only thing is, if you pull the trigger, it will still fire. So maybe if you're panicked or something, you're going to go, you pull the trigger and wonder why your gun didn't go off. But again, it's just kind of something the French wanted. Now to go ahead and compare the safety on the 1935S, well, there's kind of two different styles of safeties on the 1935S. This is the later, which is sort of standardized M1 safety. In fact, the pistols will be marked M1 on the slide. with this style of safety. That was done in the 50s, by the way. But on the S with this M1 style safety, down is safety off. I'll go ahead and cock the hammer just to give you a view. And then up is safety on. So there, so you can see the little hammer block is now protruding past the firing pin. Same deal. You can still pull the trigger. That's kind of interesting that the safety goes off. I've noticed that a couple times on this example. I don't know if that's all of them. I hope that wouldn't fire, but it seems like the hammer kind of knocks the safety out. Let's try that again. Yeah, it does impact it pretty hard, and it just moved it there. Again, it's not a fantastic safety system. I think the A is a little bit better with the up position, especially because it blocks it's in your line of sight. The S version here, when the safety's on, it's not a huge difference. If you're being shot at or something, this is not a huge difference. Another bad thing about this M1 style safety is when you rack the pistol. So the French carried it, without one in the chamber and a loaded magazine. So they'd pull the pistol out and they would, they'd rack the pistol. And the thing is, whenever back is on, I could see a person, grabbing this and flicking the safety on when they rack the pistol. I'll take the magazine out just so I can do that. So there, I kind of deliberately did it just to kind of prove there. I'm sure you could do it a lot without engaging the safety, but if you kind of did it in a hurry and your hand kind of slid along the side, it would kind of suck if you had this and say, you see somebody you need to shoot, so you pull out your pistol, and of course you need to rack the slide, and then you go to shoot, and your safety is on, so you can't actually shoot. Without a magazine, here's the hammer will not fall without the magazine. It just goes along with the magazine safety. So your gun, there you go. You pulled it out in a quickness, you aimed and shot, but you can't really tell the safety's on. Again, this is not a great design. Now the 1935A and S, they do not have a grip safety like the 1911 does. But you could kind of see why people might think so, because of the sort of piece on the back here. It looks a lot like a grip safety, but in fact, that has to do with the on-block sort of, the packet firing mechanism system on these. The French required that these pistols, sort of the hammer and the firing mechanism, all be in this one, unit that's really easy to pull out. I want to talk a bit about the magazine release on the two pistols. Of course, it's very 1911-ish. It's in a great location. It's easy to reach and everything. Now, one of the differences I've noticed between these two, and I asked another friend of mine who has an A, and he said the same thing. I have 3 different magazines, so it's not a magazine thing. But the 1935A, when you hit the magazine release, the magazine just comes out, just a little bit. Again, I guess if you wanted magazine retention, it's not a bad feature. It kind of requires you to grab and extract it. With the S, the magazine just really shoots out of there. It flies out. Even with the slide back, the magazine just, shoots out of there. It's just one of those interesting things. I don't know if one was, by design or not. The disassembly of the 1935s is very easy. I'll just start with the S here. You just simply push in on the slide stop, just pull that out, and the slide just comes off, and that's pretty much it. And here we'll do the 35A. Don't quite have to pull the slide back that far to take that out. There you go, slide comes right out. Pretty nice design. You can tell this is simplified quite a bit over the 1911. There is no bushing on these pistols. The recoil spring is captive. There's not like a separate guide and recoil spring. So these are a great improvement over the 1911. Here we'll talk a bit about the locking system of both of these. Fairly similar. They both have the swinging link Browning dropping barrel system. Now the 1935A, there's 2 links, which is quite interesting. I don't know if that's to double the strength or whatever of the system. The S just has 1 link in here. The A, if you take the barrel out, you'll notice again, this is very 1911-ish with these little locking grooves or lugs into the barrel. The 1935S is a little bit more modern. Instead of having the 2 grooves up top, kind of 1911-ish, instead it just works on this one bearing surface on the front face of sort of the chamber on the barrel here. This is a little bit more how a lot of modern handguns, lock up, like the Glock and everything. There's just this one, locking surface here. This is a pretty big improvement, I would say, over the 1935A. This is, of course, is faster and cheaper to produce, that kind of thing. So it's, as long as it works with the cartridge and design, I think it's good enough, really. And the 32 French long is not that crazy powerful where you really need too much, locking strength. So you could probably almost go direct blowback, really, with 32 French long, but that's not one of the requirements. So these both have, locking systems. Let's show you that in-block or packaged, mechanism here for the guts. It's pretty easy to just get out. You just kind of pull it straight out of the top, and there you go. It's nice because if the gun has any sort of problem, you could just have spare these packs on like the armor level or something like that, and just take one out and drop one in to replace it. It's a pretty neat system. Kind of surprised it really doesn't exist more, maybe with other militaries. So let's take a close-up of some of the markings on the 1935A. So start out just the model here, MLE 1935A, MLE for model. We have a serial number with a prefix and SACM, which is again the manufacturer of the pistol. No real markings to speak of on the other side of the handgun. Just pretty simple markings on this one. Now let's look at the markings on the 1935As. You'll see a lot more differences with these, with the manufacturer markings. Here, this one is made by, I'll just call it SAGEM, S-A-G-E-M. I'm not going to try to pronounce that company name. It's a French company that existed up until pretty recently. And then here on the right side of the handgun, here you have, you have another company logo. We have the prefix and a serial number, Model 1935S. As I mentioned before, this M1, this was stamped in the 50s. You can kind of tell the font and everything doesn't really match up. This was stamped later on to signify that this has the M1 safety. And then, caliber 7.65 long. Now the magazines on these guns are different. They're not interchangeable, not a super smart decision really, but they're marked typically something like 1935A or S, or maybe even just a 35 and then A or S. There's lots of different variations with these magazines, but here's an example of a 1935S magazine, and here is a 1935A magazine, and again, this is just marked 35A. Sometimes it's kind of facing the opposite directions, just depending on the mag. You'll see a lot of variations with these, but the A or the S will give it away what it is. Now the A has got a flat floor plate to it, where the S has a little bit of a hump to it. It's not exactly a flat floor plate. In fact, the 1950 pistol magazine looks pretty similar to this S pistol mag. The slide serrations on the S are nice, tall, pretty aggressive slide serrations. Definitely, no problem, grabbing, getting a firm grip on the slide to be able to rack it. Playing with the 35A, there's been quite a few times when my hand has wanted to just slip off of this, because these serrations, they're not very tall at all. I mean, this just is on this kind of outwardmost protruding part of the slide here at the very bottom. Usually when I'm racking the slide on this, instead of trying to grasp these serrations, I end up just sort of grabbing this, rear sight safety unit. That kind of gives me a more positive purchase than the slide serrations. So the slide serrations on the 35A are practically just worthless, really, in my experience with this. It just seems a lot easier to just grab this rear sight area. Now, as I said before, I think the 35A here is much more of a target pistol, but when it comes to the trigger, at least on this example, not so much. The trigger is, kind of a two-stage, and it's a bit hard. It's kind of a hard, kind of smushy sort of break on that trigger. It's just not that great. It's not that great of a trigger. Whereas on the 1911S or 1935S here, it's a lot more of a 1911E feeling trigger. There's not much take up, and it's not too light, but it's pretty light. It's a clean break. The trigger on this S is, I would think, much better. I could feel myself being more accurate with the S trigger than with the A trigger, which kind of stinks because with a nice trigger you could really take advantage of this longer slide, sight radius, and barrel length of the A over the S. But that's just kind of what we're stuck here with the S. The French could have had the high power if they wanted to. In fact, they kind of looked at it a little bit later in the 1930s, but really, even with all of its shortcomings, the 1935A and S were just way better. A huge improvement over the older, more obsolete, French revolvers. So one of the ways of looking at it, maybe instead of looking at it like they didn't adopt this, look at it as, they made a huge stride and improvement over their older, obsolete handguns. The 1935s were replaced in 1950 by the Mac 50. It's known as the Mac 50 pistol, but it's like the model 1950 pistol. Interestingly enough, the 1950 pistol that replaced the 1935s is based on the 1935S, which it's pretty neat that this was the second choice for the French in 1937 when they adopted it, but it kind of won in the long run because this pistol went on to become the 1950. Of course, the 1950 is chambered in 9mm. The French finally, switched to 9mm. It's a little bit beefier, the 1950 than the 1935S. But long term, both of these pistols kind of lived on beyond these initial 1935 designs, and one way or another. Overall, great design pistols, I think. You can't really go wrong basing a design on the 1911 on Browning's designs. It's hard to go wrong with that. Kind of quirky, they have a few quirky features. The neat thing is these aren't expensive. Especially the post-war 1935s, they're not that expensive. The A's are more expensive than the S's. I think it's because everyone recognizes, like, hey, this went on to to be the P210. The A's do tend to be a little bit more expensive than the S's, but you can get some really good deals out there on these French guns. Check out Millsap World merch. The link is below. Got some new designs in there. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you next time.